all for coming. Thank all the panelists for agreeing to participate in this conversation and for all your public contributions in the last years. I also want to thank Barbara Metcalf, our AHA president, for coming up with this idea and for asking me to help organize it. And I want to thank Juan especially for organizing it with me and for all his tireless work in the last decade. My name is Priya Satia, and I'm a historian of modern Britain. And what I'm going to do is try to historicize this conversation that we're having about the place of historians in public debate on the global war on terror. Because it does have its own history, and ironically enough, it's one that's very closely entangled with the history of Western intervention in Iraq itself. So when the British occupied Iraq during World War I, the British public engaged in a very similar debate about public knowledge of Middle Eastern affairs. And they did so because Britain took charge of Iraq at precisely the moment that Britain itself, for the first time, became a truly mass democracy. And democratic control had pretty much become a kind of, democratic control of foreign policy had become a sort of rallying cry. To Britons anxious for reconstruction at home after that war, military expenditure on new colonies seemed a foolish extravagance. But the British state was, of course, captive to other concerns, which we don't have to get into right now, but I'm happy to talk about later. So to evade the check of this increasingly assertive and confident democracy, not to mention anti-colonial sentiment in Iraq and all around the world, the British state evolved mechanisms for controlling Iraq as discreetly as possible. This is what I've called the invention of covert empire, a means of pursuing empire in an increasingly democratic and anti-imperial world. So what did covert empire entail? Mainly techniques of official secrecy, a government effort to limit what got discussed in public through censorship and propaganda, through autocratic colonial administration in the Middle East by an informal group of intelligence workers, and through the discrete technology of aerial control, whereby aircraft patrolled Iraq using bombardment to crush any kind of subversive activity. Air control was discrete in both an infrastructural sense and by virtue of its cheapness, which enabled it to evade the check of British taxpayers. No decorations were publicly awarded for servicemen, no casualty counts were gathered. At the same time, air demonstrations, recruitment tours, officially inspired books, and press reports all worked to cast the regime in the most favorable light possible in public. Now, historians and other kinds of Orientalists who laid claim to a special insight into an otherwise inscrutable region were crucial to the invention and implementation of all these aspects of covert empire. In many cases, they were also the intelligence workers in charge behind the scenes. They were also crucial to the cultivation of public ignorance about what was really happening in the Middle East through their participation in the kind of PR effort and propaganda effort by the state. As Edward Said told us long ago, quote, "The British agent Orientalist during and after World War I took over both the role of expert adventure eccentric and the role of colonial authority." Now, some segments of the British public and the press continued to express skepticism about the secrecy surrounding military action in Iraq, about the loud claims of the air control regime's success and humanity, and not least about the elevation of a handful of enthusiastic experts in the running of the Middle Eastern Empire. So, Middle East policy became one of the central controversies in the state's and the public's contest for control of foreign policy in Britain after World War I. This was partly because the region's Oriental qualities were alleged to have inspired the state's new kind of forms of cunning as it operated in that region. And this controversy produced a new understanding of the role of the historian. Because one of the most prolific contributors to this public conversation about Iraq in Britain after World War I was a man called Edward Thompson, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, whose career started out as a missionary and a literature scholar in India before he went off to serve as an army chaplain with the 2nd Royal Leicestershires in Iraq. After the war, back in Britain from 1919 to 1933, he published several books based on his wartime experiences, including poetry, memoirs, and a novel as well. The liberal critique of empire he expressed with a revisionist account of the Indian Mutiny in 1925 was part of this extended kind of meditation on Iraq and his own experiences there. His disillusionment with imperial government fueled a passionate faith in the historian's craft as the most effective means of truth-telling against the state. So if historians were involved in the creation of covert empire, they were also critical to its unmasking. The period of British rule in Iraq gave us our 20th century understanding of the historian's role as essentially political activist and critic of the state. Edward Thompson's son, E.P. Thompson, grew up, as he put it, quote, expecting governments to be mendacious and imperialist, and expecting that one's stance ought to be hostile to government. While participating in political efforts such as the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, E.P. Thompson invoked the historic libertarian tradition of working-class people as the only force capable of checking the excesses of what he called the secret state that had emerged in 20th century Britain. He realized that modern democracy, simply by virtue of its insistent demand for openness, tends to foster an almost paranoid official secrecy, and that the historian is the archetype of the active citizen. So as a result of the interwar conversation, British radicals became permanent cynics about their state, and generations of Iraqis grew paranoid about the skillfully hidden hands guiding their country's destiny. But still, the techniques of covert empire were effective enough to enable Britain to remain ultimate masters of Iraq well after the formal declaration of Iraqi independence in 1932. The Royal Air Force and British intelligence personnel remained discreetly in place and continued to put a positive spin on the news of Iraqi admission to the League of Nations, with long-term effects. Among the